Welcome to another episode of the On the Water podcast. I'm Jimmy Fee.
And I'm Kevin Blinkoff.
And we took a little bit of a winter break from the podcasting, Kevin, but we're back with another season of the On the Water podcast starting now. We're going to be putting them out every other Monday.
Really excited to start a new season. Really appreciate everybody's support. It's been great. If you're enjoying the podcast, please leave us a 5-star rating, subscribe, like us, please. That all helps so much. And also in the comments, hey, let us know what you like, what you don't like. What do you want to see us do next? And we'll do our best to make it happen.
So we've got a great guest to kick off this new season of the On the Water podcast in Dr. Jeff Kneebone. He works at the New England State Aquarium, the Anderson Cabot Center, and he does a lot of tagging studies with large pelagic fish, tuna, sharks. And we talked about him, the results of some of these studies, his insights into how these big fish move tunas, and how you can kind of apply that to your fishing. I found it fascinating. I learned a lot from it. I think you guys will learn a lot. But before we get into that, since it is a new season of the On the Water Fishing podcast, and we've got a new fishing season starting, it's a good time to talk about resolutions, fishing resolutions.
Yes, let's keep it to fishing. We've all got plenty of other resolutions, but if we keep it to fishing, Jimmy, what are some of your big fishing resolutions for 2023?
I have a lot. Fishing more is always one of them. But I also feel like I've gotten away the last couple of years. Life's gotten pretty busy. It's gotten busy here at On the Water. It's gotten busy with two little kids at home. So I haven't done as much like outside the office fishing research and reading. I feel like back when I worked at the bait and tackle shop, I was a total gear nerd. Like I knew, the new model spinning reel is going to be a ½ ounce lighter and it's got an extra ball bearing. I feel like I've gotten away from a lot of that. I'd like to get back into being a big time gear nerd and snob. Maybe not snob.
But yeah, I understand what you're saying, kind of get back into it. And it's almost tricky sometimes. The gear advances so fast. There's always something new out there, something to learn about. But, that's kind of our job, stay on top of things and learn about the new gear. So, yeah, I think that's an excellent resolution. And hopefully you'll share some of your knowledge with the rest of us, help us stay geared up as well.
And on the flip side of that, I want to get back and dive into more of the history behind some fishing products. That's something that, especially with surf casting, there's so much mythology behind all the different lure designs that are unique to surf fishing for striped bass. And that's something that I know a little bit about, but I want to know a lot more about. So, how about you?
So my fishing resolutions for the new year, I feel like every year is recently has been kind of the same. Is get better at fly fishing, which, yeah, I
don't mean to laugh.
It's I think it's the nature of fly fishing, and it's something that I'm relatively new to. And one of the reasons I love it so much is because I feel like I've got a lot to learn. And every year I get out there and I'm tying my own flies, I'm finding fish, and I'm spending a lot of time casting at fish and getting rejected. And it's fun, it's exciting. It's also frustrating. And every year I spend the off season, I tie up new flies and say like, all right, this is going to be the one that fools those stripers that are eating bunker and they are looking at my flies and not eating them. Like this, I've cracked the code. And that's kind of what I look forward to in the spring is getting out in my kayak, seeing those fish and throwing my flies at them. And hopefully this year, I think this is the year I do it. I crack the code, figure out what they want. It's
a good one. That's a good one. For years, I had the same one, do more fly fishing. I think I want to do less fly fishing this year. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that being is, well, one, I broke my favorite fly rod last year. One of my main goals of 2022 was catch an albie on the fly rod. And I did, sort of. It was a really blustery, windy day. Incredibly tough to fly cast from a kayak, so I just had the fly trailing behind me. I was trolling, okay?
You were trolling a fly.
I was trolling the fly. Yeah. I was going to make it sound accidental. But no, I was very purposely trolling the fly and hooked an albie on it and then broke the rod, which felt like it was kind of that's why. You broke the rod because you were trying to do the shortcut to this albie on the fly. And anyhow, so I haven't replaced that rod. And I like specific fly fishing things. I want to do more fly fishing for pickerel. I'd like to do more fly fishing for bluefish. Those are two very aggressive fish. So I'd like to hit the easy button on fly fishing. Just I enjoy it. I like fighting the fish on the fly rod. I like feeling them take the fly. But I don't have a strong desire to catch an albie on the fly this year, striper fishing. Just hearing your struggles, I think, how you've taken something that was very fun and complicated it.
I will say I I love fly fishing for northern pike for that exact reason. Northern pike are kind of like the easy button. For the most part, they are so aggressive. They love flies. They love poorly tied flies, I think even better than beautiful flies. So I'll go out there with something I tied this winter that I know is not the best looking fly, and the pike jump all over it, and it's like, this is fun. This is the positive reinforcement that I need.
And those are big fish too. I mean, it's not like a little pickerel. I can't imagine hooking a 40-inch fish pike on the fly rod. That's got to be a blast. Tuna fishing are always pretty high on my New Year's resolution list. But last year, after I really went, I tried so hard to catch tuna last year and it didn't go so well. I kind of got obsessed with it to the expense of striped bass fishing. So I was so focused on tuna, getting out to the tuna grounds, trying to catch them, that I missed a lot of good striped bass fishing, particularly in August and September. So this year I'm going to try to maybe ease back, not get so crazy about the tuna, and just focus on stripers more. So we'll see. We'll see how that changes when the first tuna show up in late June. But for now, I'd like to maybe cool off on tuna. If I caught more and had more successful tuna trips in 2022, it would be a different story.
And then I would say my final resolution for this year, I've watched you teach your kids how to fish and how much that means to you. It's inspiring. I don't have kids, but I've got nieces and nephews, and this is the year that I definitely want to do a better job. I want to get them out there. They're getting to be that age right now where I can put a push button Zebco in their hands or a spin cast combo like that and hopefully not catch a hook in the head. So yeah, I think a little fishing on the dock with the nieces and nephews, seeing them get their first sunfish, that's something I want to have happen this year.
Kevin, I think that's a good one for everybody, not just kids, but introducing new anglers to the sport. That is something that, you talk to a lot of fishermen and you think, why would I want more people fishing? But in many ways, it's a good thing. It's a very good thing, not just for people in the business, but if you're a fisherman, more people to fight for, access to fishing spots, more people to fight for, we see this example every time there's a proposed change to the striped bass regulations, more fishermen in favor of, more conservative or better regulations.
Anglers, hunters, outdoors people, the original conservationists. So, I mean, the more fishermen we have keeping the sport alive, the better it is for fishing and for the resource itself, educating anglers as well, and of course, to take care of the resource, to be conservationists, also important. But yeah, we need to keep our sport, keep the traditions alive, and keep it growing.
That's a great point, and that sets up our guest, Dr. Jeff Kneebone, really well. A lot of his research is aimed at that angler education, at keeping fishing strong, and I think you guys are really going to enjoy this episode. Thanks again for tuning in to the On the Water podcast.
Today's episode of the On the Water podcast is brought to you by Old Town Canoe and Kayaks. Old Town has been making the finest canoes and kayaks for over 120 years, right on the banks of the Penobscot River in Maine. Their line of sportsman fishing kayaks has options for every angler, fresh and salt, inshore and offshore, and they come in paddle, pedal, and power versions. I'm a huge fan of saltwater kayak fishing, and I absolutely love my Old Town Sportsman Big Water 132 pedal kayak. It's big enough to take offshore and out into open water, but it's nimble enough for fishing inshore in the backwaters. Plus, it's super stable. I am totally comfortable standing up in my kayak, fly fishing for striped bass. I also use it to bottom fish for black sea bass and tautog. In the fall, I take it out on the water almost every day to chase false albacore. Absolutely my favorite fish to chase from the kayak. So if you're looking to get into kayak fishing, or if you're maybe already a kayak fishing addict and you're just looking to upgrade, I highly recommend checking out the Old Town Sportsman line of kayaks. You can take a look online at oldtowncanoe.com/onthewater. Once again, that's oldtowncanoe.com/onthewater. Check them out.
Welcome to another episode of the On the Water podcast. I'm Jimmy Fee. This is Kevin Blinkoff. And this week's guest, we have Dr. Jeff Kneebone of the Anderson Cabot Center for Marine Life. Did I get that right? Is that the...
Ocean Life.
Ocean Life. Okay.
Close enough.
So tell us a little bit about the Anderson Cabot Center.
Yeah, so first off, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. The Anderson Cabot Center for Ocean Life at the New England Aquarium you can basically think of it as like the research arm of the aquarium. So everyone knows that there's actual building in Boston that has all of the marine life that you can go and see. It's an iconic building. I celebrated its 50th anniversary last year. But the Anderson Cabot Center is kind of like a separate but related entity. So we have a bunch of scientists on staff that do research on a multitude of different things. So myself, I'm part of a fisheries science and emerging technologies group. We're basically focused on tagging. That's where the technology angle comes in. We're mostly focused on fish, but there's also a scientist in our group that studies sea turtles. But it's a lot of marine research related. We all kind of commingle, help each other. But there's also the iconic North Atlantic right whale research program that's at the Anderson Cabot Center, and we also have other staff that deal with like seafood, sustainability, and things like that. So it's kind of all encompassing.
And a little bit about your background. You're from New Jersey originally, right? And been a fisherman your whole life?
Yep, that's true. Fellow Jerseyan. Started fishing down there for trout when I was 2 years old. And I've had the passion my whole life. Started out on head boats, party boats at Atlantic Islands, probably like you, Jimmy, fishing for fluke. My uncle had a boat in Connecticut on the Western Long Island Sound. I got into tautog fishing up there and sea bass fishing, and then gradually got into the offshore game, living down there, fishing out of Montauk. And then as I went to school, the obsession grew, I'd say, and I made my passion my profession, and that's what brings me here today, I guess.
Yeah, that you were able to do quite a bit of recreational fishing. Well, I guess it is recreational fishing through your work and doing the tagging, because you catch a lot of the fish that you end up tagging yourself, right?
Yeah, it's definitely kind of a double dipping, I'd say, a little bit. My passion for fishing and the ocean and sustainable fishing and responsible fishing is really what drives me as a scientist. Because, when I go home and I want to relax, I want to go fishing, and who doesn't want to have good fishing, right? So that's kind of how it all comes together. But yeah, I am lucky that a lot of my research involves fishing. I was just talking with Kevin before this started that when I first had the idea to do this, it was all great. Like, oh, wow, I get to go fishing as part of my job. But over time, I've learned that it's becoming more and more like a job. Like when you just go fishing for fun and you just keep it recreational, it's way different than how I go about it now. When I go on a trip, I have an objective. We need to catch this many fish. We need to catch these fish here. The fish need to be in good condition for tagging. So there's a lot more that goes in through my mind. So it's definitely still fun at times, but it's most fun when I've had a good day and checked a lot of the boxes and the research has gone well. So it's a little bit less like fishing, but I do still enjoy it a lot.
That's good.
And some of your early research that you were working on was on sand tiger sharks in Massachusetts, and I think you were specifically looking at catching sand tiger sharks and releasing them and that effect. But the sand tiger shark, such an interesting shark species that we're seeing in Massachusetts and throughout the Northeast. Can you tell me a little bit about kind of what that research was and what you learned about sand tiger sharks?
Sure. So that was work I did when I was getting my PhD at UMass Dartmouth. My advisor was Dr. Greg Scommel from the Mass Division of Marine Fisheries. So he and his colleague there, who's now moved on, his name's John Chisholm, they realized that there were these juvenile sand tigers that were showing up in Duxbury Bay year after year. And that was kind of a surprise to them because it was an area that the sharks hadn't really been in previously. They're more focused down around Nantucket and Nantucket Sound. And then when they started showing up in abundance north of the Cape, it was kind of, surprising. So that's where I came in as a student. We did a bunch of tagging on them to just figure out what was happening in that bay. We found that Plymouth, Kingston, Duxbury system is a nursery for juvenile sand tigers. So they're not born there, but they're born off North Carolina and Florida, and the juveniles migrate up the coast and spend the summers in Duxbury Bay, and what we've come to learn now is other bays all along the coast of New England. So after that research ended, I expanded to do work in Wollaston Beach, and there's also juvenile sand tigers that use that area just like they do in Duxbury Bay. And we've tracked individual sand tigers back to Wollaston Beach year after year, just like we did individuals coming back to Duxbury Bay year after year. So it's kind of interesting because you have a species growing in its use in New England, but individual fish are also exhibiting, behavior where they're coming back to the same spot year after year.
Now, do we see the adult sand tigers up here as much, or is it mainly juveniles?
That's a great question. When I first started doing this work, which was a while ago now, like 14 years, was when we started. It was all juveniles. It was very rare to hear about an adult, but in the past couple years, in Nantucket Sound, we've started to see more adults. And that's actually was common 100 years ago or more. So in the early 1900s, there was actually a commercial fishery for sand tigers around Nantucket. And if you go to the Nantucket Historical Society, you can see photos of big sand tigers that were caught over there. So they used to be here. And then they kind of became rare, I guess, when the population went down. And now we're seeing the adults come back, specifically around like the islands in later summer.
That's interesting, because my first thought when I saw adult sand tiger sharks starting to come back, we'd been seeing them more down toward New Jersey. The bigger adult ones seemed common. And as they start to come back further north, I was wondering if that was a global warming, a warming oceans issue, or just range expansion. So it sounds like that's something that in the past was common. So it's more about sand tiger sharks, just more of them being out there, and the range of the adults is pushing north.
Yeah, it's probably a little bit of a population resurgence thing. So they were there, and then they kind of got fished down and contracted to what we were talking about, their core habitat. Like when fish populations get depleted, a lot of times they concentrate in the areas that are optimal for them. And then when they start to build back up, they swim around a little bit more and search for new areas. And that might be what we're seeing now, is like recolonization of historical habitat. But the other side of that with the climate angle might be true as well, because the juveniles definitely move further north than the adults. And we're starting to get reports of juvenile sand tigers being caught up in the Bay of Fundy in New Brunswick, like way further north than you'd expect. So we were, 15 years ago, it was surprising for us to see him, just north of the Cape. And now if you do some Googling, you'll see articles about, from Canada and way up in Maine, of people saying the same thing, like, wow, what is this shark? They're in our bays. And that may be related to water temperature, or even the expansion of prey species like menhaden, which is their primary target.
So when we first, a couple years ago, we had the chance to film with you tagging a different species of shark. The Sandbar shark is the official name, but fishermen seem to call them the brown shark. And that was part of a project where you were doing the tags. You described them as kind of like a Fitbit on the shark. And that was to measure how well they survived catch and release by surf fishermen. How did that, I think that was the first year of the project, maybe the second. And the goal was to tag 50 sharks. And you've completed that, right? That one?
Yeah, that was the first year of the project. Pre-pandemic, I think, which seems like a lifetime ago. But that project was a great success. We ended up tagging 67 sandbars from shore. We did the work on the Cape and then on Nantucket, and worked with over a dozen different fishermen to observe their behaviors and, the techniques that they use to handle the sharks. And again, the goal was to see how well they do after catch and release. And the results were really, really great, really encouraging. So out of the 67 that we tagged, all 67 were alive at the time when the tag came off. So the tags, those little Fitbits, stayed on for, I think, like the shortest one was about 12 hours and the longest one was up to 10 days. So we had insights into short-term survival, like what happens right after you release them. And then we also could see what happens, days, weeks after release. So 100% survived. There was a lot of different tackle types used. We had a range of fight times from like 3 minutes to 30 minutes. Fish hooked in every place, in the fin, in the back, mouth, in the gut, in the gills. Different handling techniques, like people dragging them all the way out of the water. We had fish that were left in the water, kind of some that are left in the surf line. So it was just really good to see that the sharks are resilient and capable of recovering from and surviving a lot of different handling practices. The other thing that was neat was the tags let us know a little bit about how long it takes them to recover. Like whenever you or I or anyone exercises, you may huff and puff, you may have to sit on the couch for a little while and recover. And we could see that in the tagging data. So the sharks could recover pretty quickly. It's like in less than 12 hours, they were back to swimming normally. They have a different diving behavior, like when they come off the bottom and they beat their tails differently. So we used all that data in aggregate to look at the recovery. So high survival rates and ability to recover relatively quickly. So that was good news.
Now, just to back up a second, could you tell us a little bit about brown sharks? I feel like that's the most common shark that the fishermen target from the surf up here and even sometimes from the boat, but we don't necessarily know a ton about them. Is it correct? Are they related to bull sharks? Is that right?
Yeah. So sandbar sharks are in the genus Carcharinus. So that's kind of like, you think back to high school biology, you have genus and species, right? So a lot of the sharks that look very similar, like the sandbar shark, the dusky shark, the bull shark, black tip, spinner, they're all in the same genus, Carcharinus. So that's why they all kind of look like your run-of-the-mill shark. So in that regard, they are fairly related in the grand scheme of things, where they're part of the same genus. But again, it's different species. Sandbars are kind of like the bull shark of the north. Bull sharks have that big stout body, the big dorsal fin. If you look at a sandbar, they're fairly similar. So a lot of times they're confused with one another. Like people will catch a sandbar and say, oh, that's a bull shark. But two different species, but definitely related.
And real quick, can you describe the difference between a sandbar shark and a sand tiger shark?
I can definitely do that. So they are from different genus. So sandbars are kind of like, I'd say you're run-of-the-mill shark. When you think of a shark, you're thinking of a sandbar shark. Just brown coloration on top, big dorsal fin. Sand tigers are definitely lighter in color, like a little bit more olive green. They've got spots on them that are more prevalent in the juveniles. Like the juveniles really, really have dark spots, and the adults, it kind of fades to that green. Their mouth looks more like a mako's mouth than it does a sandbar. So sandbars actually have like not huge teeth. Like it's still a menacing bite that they can inflict. But if you look at a sand tiger's mouth, it's like a gnarled mess of pointy teeth. Looks more like a mako's teeth. And then they have two big dorsal fins, and their tail looks a little bit different. So it would be easier if I had a photo to go through. But
we could put one up on the video.
Yeah.
But yeah, I remember the New England Aquarium actually used to have sand tiger sharks in the big tank. I don't think they do anymore, but I remember as a kid seeing them, and it was, like you mentioned, the mouth, all those teeth sticking out in all kinds of directions. They looked really menacing. They kind of swam around slowly and lurked, but definitely a very different look from a sandbar, which is, like you said, if you're a 6-year-old and you're asked to draw a shark, you draw a sandbar shark. It's like kind of your typical shark look.
Yeah, they've got the big, tall dorsal fin, and
And what are the sizes on them people are encountering mostly in New England or in the Northeast?
For sand tigers or sandbar?
For both.
So we talked about sand tigers a little bit before. It's still, you got the range of the juvenile. So man, the smallest one that I ever tagged, I think in centimeters, because that's where my brain goes, but I'm going to say it's about maybe 32 inches, up to now with the adults, they can be 7 feet to the fork of the tail. That's another thing. My brain always goes to fork length. So, you have the notch in the tail of the sharks. I always measure to that. A lot of people think total length. So probably total length on the sand tiger from the tip of the nose to the tip of the tail up to 9 feet. In our areas.
Yeah, when you're fishing for fun, you get every inch you measure from the tip of the nose to the tip of the tail.
As big as you can get. Yep. And then for sandbars, it's kind of the same. So we see juvenile sandbars that are probably around like 3 feet to the fork and the tail. So 100 centimeters. That's about the smallest one I've seen. And then the biggest one we got was probably 6.5 foot fork length. So that's a 7-footer. If people talk about, getting a 7-footer from the beach, and that fish is 150, 175 pounds. So it's a decent animal. So that's kind of the general range. On Nantucket, do you see some of those big females come in? They're a little bit more common out there. But that's the general range. One thing I will say is that, whereas we see like basically newborn sand tigers coming up to New England, like really small ones, we don't see the newborn sandbars. So they're born down in the Chesapeake and Delaware Bay region. That's their nursery habitat. So when sandbars are born, they're pretty small. They're maybe like 20, 24 inches long. And they kind of hang out down there in their nursery area until they get a little bit bigger. And then they start migrating up the coast. But the sand tiger is unique in that as soon as they're born, we think that they start migrating right away.
Mm-hmm. And both species are currently protected species, correct?
Correct.
And so in Massachusetts, we're allowed to fish for them from the beach with the expectation that you use a circle hook, inline circle hook, and release the shark as quickly as possible without dragging it too far out of the water, without any unnecessary harm to the fish. So it's really great to hear the results of your study, basically saying that that effect of angling on sandbar sharks in particular seems to not have as much of an effect on their mortality. So it seems like that's a sustainable fishery that hopefully we can continue. It seems it's growing in popularity, I think, as we're seeing more sharks around. It's become a really popular summertime pursuit, sharking from the beach. So,
and it's not legal in every state.
Right.
Long Island, you're not allowed to, or New York, you're not allowed to do it. New Jersey, I don't believe you can do it either. Catch and release the ground sharks. I mean, you can. There's a gray area. You go out and you cast something into a chunk of fish into the surf. You don't know what's going to eat it, so you're not necessarily targeting them. But here in Massachusetts, we can say we're going to go target brown sharks from the beach or sandbar sharks from the beach. And studies like yours. Now, will that help inform fisheries regulations? Will they be able to cite a study like that and say, okay, we can continue to allow this to happen?
Yeah, that's really the intent of all of the research that I do is, I got to go back to how when I introduced myself, my drive as a scientist is sustainable and responsible fishing. I want fishing to occur. I fish constantly myself. It's my passion. It's also my profession. And we hope that our research will be able to be used by policymakers to inform regulation. But I'll say one caveat about our sandbar study. We use voluntary fishermen, yourself included, Jimmy, and John Malloy, who's become a good friend of mine, who hooked me up with you guys to do that episode. But basically, we worked with fishermen who are already responsible, right? And they're using best practices. They're cognizant of the potential impact on the fish. So some might say that we had like the best case scenario where we captured. If you fish responsibly and handle the animals properly, this is what the outcome could be. And that's good. So we know that if you know what you're doing, you're using the right gear, you're cognizant of the animal's welfare and everything that goes along with it, they're going to survive. But where we have room for growth is getting at the newcomers, right? The guys who are just getting into this, who are looking to other people for advice about what to use, how do you handle the fish? How long is too long? So it's the outreach component that's really important. So we want to send the message that yes, this fishery can exist, but we also want to send the message that it needs, people need to be responsible when they go out and fish for these animals. And that's kind of the next step in the process. So yes, here are the results of our study, but our outreach is going to say, if you do things properly, this is what we can achieve, and we should be striving for this.
That's great. Yeah, after, what's it been, 10 years, 15 years, the brown sharks, or sandbars have been protected. And I definitely, at least anecdotally, I seem to be seeing an increase of them. I remember years ago when I first moved up to Cape Cod in 2008, 2009, you would maybe get a couple bites a week if you were going to go out shark fishing from the beach 3-4 nights a week. Now I can count on 3 to 4 bites a night, it seems like. There definitely seem to be more of them around, at least from my perspective. I don't know if that's supported by any research or...
Yeah, so it's kind of a similar story to sand tigers, where sandbars reacted negatively to directed fishing pressure in the 80s and the early 90s. There was a directed longline fishery for them, a commercial fishery. And, sharks in general, there's a fine line about how many is too many, just because of the way that they go about life and reproducing, giving birth to relatively few young, taking a long time to reach maturity. That is a recipe for problems when you start removing a lot of individuals. So sand tigers and sandbars both kind of went on the same trajectory. Late 80s, early 90s, populations start going down, and we saw it here. They became rare or uncommon in New England, and since both of them have been prohibited the sand tiger since 97, I think the sandbar since 2008 maybe, the populations are going the other direction, and we see that here in New England. I definitely think that there are more sandbars around. We have a new PhD student who's based in Nantucket who's doing a new tagging with sandbars around the island and the sound to try to see how the animals are using this region. And hopefully through that research, we can kind of track what the population is doing and as it continues to grow in the region.
I had a first this season in the surf where there was a string of 3 or 4 nights in late June when there were so many sharks I was striped bass fishing, and I had brown sharks take stripers off the line for me. And I've had that happen with seals plenty of times. It was the first time it happened 3 nights in a row, and then I had to move somewhere else. And I don't know, it was a little eerie. I mean, because they would come right at you, and I saw another one in September that swam right up to me on the rock.
And it wasn't just your experience. We heard that from a lot of readers and on the water fans. It seemed pretty, much more common than it ever has been in years past.
Yeah, Long Island Sound especially. Those guys saw a lot of them.
In both striped bass fishing and also in some of the tuna fisheries.
Yeah, the tuna was the tuna brown sharks, or was that?
I believe some of them were, yeah. So that's becoming an issue now, and that's not it's not an easy solution there. I mean, it's something that we're going to have to deal with as sharks come back. And usually the responsible thing to do is fish somewhere else if that's an issue.
Yeah, shark depredation is a hot button topic throughout, everywhere in the from Texas up to Maine, and even in Canada now. There's white shark problems with giant bluefin up there. So it's really... It's a problem that is becoming more and more prevalent, and it's getting a lot more attention. I see it affects our research. So we do tagging of big eyes and yellowfins, and a couple years ago we were fishing out of Oregon Inlet, and we had a really hard time deploying tags on both tuna species because of shark depredation. We couldn't. If we'd hook a fish, we couldn't get it to the boat to be tagged. And even after we tagged and released it, we documented shark predation post-release of the tagged fish. I wrote an article for On the Water several years ago about yellowfin post-release mortality, and the biggest source of mortality of released yellowfin was depredation by sharks. So yeah, this is a huge problem. You go down to Oregon Inlet and talk to guys about shark depredation, you're gonna hear a lot about it. They've been experiencing it for years, and then just this year, I feel like was the first time it hit home in southern New England. We had the big pushy yellows inshore this year, and there was a lot of those carcharinid sharks. I personally tagged duskies, sandbars, and spinners, dusky, sandbar, spinners, all in that area where the yellowfins were. And I saw guys getting bit off by sharks. I myself lost a bluefin that I was hoping to tag right in there to some species of shark. So yeah, it's happening. The ocean is changing. The question we have as researchers is what species are really responsible? Is it the sandbars and duskies that are a problem in North Carolina? Is it those same sharks that are coming up and doing the same thing in New England? Or is it just kind of like a learned thing where sharks are just becoming accustomed to the signs of fishing, and they're opportunistic predators, and when they see the opportunity, they're going to take it. So I think the problem of shark depredation is it's becoming louder and louder, and I think and hope over the coming years we'll see more and more research being focused on where it's happening and why it's happening.
Yeah, just a quick aside of one of the nights when it happened. There were a ton of stripers out, and the stripers were in the faster moving water in the rip, And the sharks, every once in a while, you'd see one come up and fin or swirl. They were on the inside the seam and kind of the eddy, and you would hook a striper, and you would be able to fight him to that seam, and then all of a sudden, the striper would either freak out, you try to get it past the sharks, or it would get eaten. My friend Dave had one, came in with what was a 15-pound bass reduced to about an 8-pound bass, and he had the head, and we're standing there's some current going downstream. You can see the down below, so you can see the sharks down there. I said, Dave, you have to throw that head away. I said, you want me to do it? And he it kind of hit his ego. He goes, oh, I can throw it. And then he dropped it right at my feet. But the shark came up, watched a real nice sandbar come up, grab the head, and then kind of swim off. But it was an eerie experience being waist deep with that happening, 5 feet away. But
yeah, and the biggest question that's being raised coast-wide is increase in shark depredation related to the rebounding populations. If you look at the videos from South Florida, there seem to be a lot of those carcharodonid sharks down there. So it may just be collateral damage from successful fisheries management. The shark stocks are being rebuilt, and now is there a new imbalance happening? So again, just hope that more research happens in that arena, because I feel like it has to. It's a problem everywhere, and it's not very well understood, and we need to know more about it and to figure out how to solve the problem.
Yeah, we're starting to see some creative ways to avoid shark depredation. We've seen also some products come out to the market. I think they're magnetic or some sort of device that you can attach to your line that when you're fishing will repel sharks or keep them away from your catch. So it'll be interesting to see in the coming years kind of how fishermen adapt and where this goes.
Yeah, I'm very interested to see it, and I hope that I can be a part of it as a researcher. I've tried to break into the arena. Haven't had success yet, but that doesn't mean I'm going to stop trying.
now moving on to a different species of shark, you've done some tagging studies with Thresher Sharks, which I think are just the coolest sharks we have up here. I mean, they are just wild looking. They have the long tail that they use to whip around in front of them to stun the bait fish to catch, and they've got really small mouths for a shark. What's your research? What's your research with Threshers been like?
Yeah, I agree. They're an awesome fish, and that's one fish that when I go out tagging them, it's fun because they're the most challenging shark to catch, in my opinion. It's almost like tuna fishing, at least to me. So I love going out for them. So the project has been going on for probably 5 years now. So threshers are kind of a species that, everyone is caught, but the science isn't really there for them. So what we're trying to do is figure out what their migration is. We know that we have them here during the summer and the fall, but we want to know where they are throughout the entire year. So where do they spend the winter? How are they splitting their time from inshore and offshore waters? And then a big question is, how does the population we see here fit into the broader North Atlantic region? So there's threshers off the UK and Ireland. There's some in the Mediterranean. So we know that they're over on the other side of the Atlantic, but we want to know if it's the same population, or if you kind of have an east and a west. Because if you think like makos or tiger sharks, even like bluefin, they swim across the Atlantic. Blue sharks do the same. We kind of want to know, what are the threshers doing?
Now, there was that one winter a few years ago where it got super cold over a really short period of time in December, and we had 4 Thresher Sharks wash up on the beach. I think it was mid-December, that froze to death and washed up on the beach in Cape Cod Bay. And that was way later than I always thought of them as being kind of like a southern New England and below shark, but that was December, and they were still in Cape Cod Bay then, although to their detriment.
Yeah, so Cape Cod Bay is kind of like a bad place to be at that time of year. You hear about all the cold stunned turtles that are collected from all the Cape beaches. The Cape is like a trap. The fish are maybe swimming south and they get stuck in Cape Cod Bay, especially in that Wellfleet region, whereas all those threshers were. I can see it being a very confusing place to be for an animal.
It's like a natural fish weir.
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. So yeah, not really sure what happened to those sharks in there. They may have just gotten trapped in shallow water and just been cold stunned themselves and died, and then they froze after they washed up. But yeah, they continue to, I guess, amaze me. Like, we didn't really understand anything about their migration beforehand. Now we're seeing that they're actually up in the winter. They're kind of like in two different areas. So we've tracked them out in the middle of the Atlantic, like in association with the Gulf Stream. And we've seen fish that are been tagged off Canada, like the Grand Banks, the Scotian Shelf region, come back through southern New England region in like January and February, but they're not inshore. Like they're on the northern edge of the Gulf Stream. But, to your point, you said, up further north, like, yeah, they're up north. They're probably in Canada right now, kind of making their way down. And that's kind of a gradual process throughout the winter. And we see other threshers during the winter that are down off North Carolina all the way down to Florida. So this is kind of like a big area that they spread out in over the winter, but they're not all doing the same thing, I guess, is my point. And that's what we continue to learn about as we tag more and more.
Now, threshers I think of as one of the three kind of big game sharks that recreational fishermen historically like to target. You'd have the threshers, the makos, and poor beagles up further north. Now, makos are on hard times right now. You're not allowed to retain them at all after regulations got stricter and stricter. And eventually, it was this July, they shut it off completely. Compared to mako sharks, how are the threshers doing?
That's a great question. I don't think we really know. So shorefin makos are managed by ICAT, the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tunas, and there's a stock assessment process that ICAT undergoes to kind of assess how makos are doing in the North Atlantic. Now, again, makos, we know, migrate throughout the North Atlantic. They're going from west to east. So it's like a whole area assessment of the population north of the equator. And that's been going on for years. And there's a big process behind it. With threshers, there is no stock assessment. So they're kind of not on the ICAT radar yet. There's a little bit more interest growing with them, but essentially we don't have that stock or population assessment for the species. There's a couple studies that have used fisheries dependent data, primarily like long line catch records, to infer that the population is in decline. But through our own work, we've seen that there's kind of been an inshore shift with the threshers too. So like those studies used pelagic longline data. And as we know, pelagic longlines primarily exist are fished offshore. Right. So if you have the species that you're catching, if they're shifting inshore and the fishery is staying in the same place, a decline may not be a decline. It may just be the animals are moving further inshore. So basically, we don't really know what the population status is. And that's one of the things I remain really interested in, because I think that they've shifted further inshore. We're seeing them very, very close to shore. A couple years ago, fishermen in Long Island were even catching them from shore. They're definitely more common closer to shore than they were when I first started fishing in this region. So the big question is, have they shifted their distribution? Why did that happen, if it did happen? And what does the population look like now? And that's all grounds for our future research, and hopefully will be answered in part by our current research.
Going back to that inshore shift, possible inshore shift in thresher sharks, could that be related to all the menhaden we've been seeing and that kind of population boom that's happened over the last 5-6 years?
Yeah, it absolutely could. I mean, they're perfectly built to feed on menhaden, and you guys released a cool video, I believe, of a thresher going through a bunker pod, and that's what they're built to do: go into those schools of fish and whack them and swallow them whole with those small mouths. So if the food is there, a predator's going to find it, and that might very well be why the threshers are so common inshore now. And and even up in the Gulf of Maine too. Like just in the last 15 years, I feel like there's been more up there, and you have lots of schooling fish up there too, with herring and mackerel. And also there's more menhaden going into the Gulf of Maine now. it's kind of related to the sand tigers too. You know, if you got more menhaden going up into Maine, the little sand tiger is going to find it. And it's funny. I think someone told me in Maine, they call them pogie sharks because they see them when there's a bunch of pogies.
That's funny. I never heard that. Now, I do want to move over to some of your tuna tagging, but before that, like I would think that being a marine biologist who gets to work with sharks must be the most coveted. If somebody, going into college wants to pursue that route, how would they go to work on sharks? Because I went through for marine biology, and I said to my professor, like, I'd like to work with sharks. He goes, well, there's not that many jobs out there that allow working with sharks. With your grades, you'll be working with algae. So I kind of pivoted. So, but anyhow, if somebody wanted to follow that route, what would you recommend? So.
I'd say the number one thing is don't think you're going to be working with sharks right away. If you go in with that mindset, it could be a recipe for disappointment. But it's almost like you got to, at least I'm going to speak about my personal experience and approach. It was like I had to earn it, right? So when I went to the University of New Hampshire for undergrad coming out of Jersey, and I definitely had a passion for sharks then, but I didn't work on sharks until I was a graduate student. So after I went through college, and I started out doing research on soft shell clams and skates and other species of fish. I basically just took opportunities to learn more about the marine environment in general and the scientific process in general, and kind of build my resume and gain the experience that I needed to be competitive for an opportunity to work on sharks. Like you said, it's coveted. There's kind of limited opportunities, but you need to make sure that you put yourself in the best position possible to be able to compete for one of those positions. So don't go in thinking that this is the only thing I want to do and I'm going to do this or nothing. Like if you're really passionate about it and you want to get there, see the forest through the trees and just do whatever you can to get better, improve your skills, and put yourself in a position to strike while the iron's hot.
That's great. Thank you. If I could tell 18-year-old Jim that, I would.
I think you did just fine.
So some of the other fish you work with are tuna. Yellowfin and big eye are the predominant tuna you work with?
Yeah, I will say, since we just were on the shark topic, I definitely came into when I was younger, I had more of a focus on sharks, and now I'm definitely going in a different direction. I think I'm becoming more and more interested in what people call fin fish or bony fish like tunas and other things. So yeah, I guess the species that I study the most is yellowfin. I've been working with a colleague, Dr. Walt Golett, who's at the University of Maine, and my colleague and former advisor, Dr. Diego Bernal, who's at UMass Dartmouth. We've been working on kind of tracking yellowfin for the last maybe 4 or 5 years. It's kind of the same question as we have for the common threshers in the Atlantic. So we know that yellowfin move throughout the North Atlantic. We know that there's a connection with North Africa, but we want to better understand how they're moving around in space and time. Like, are they making transatlantic migrations regularly, like annually? Because, there's yellowfin spawn in specific areas. It's thought they spawn in the Gulf of Mexico, kind of in the Caribbean region, and then in the Gulf of Guinea, which is off the northwest coast of Africa. But the question is, are they moving it back and forth between spawning areas? Are they remaining connected to one of them? So like if we catch a yellowfin up here, is it a fish that was spawned in the Gulf of Guinea off Africa? Or could that be a fish that was spawned in the Gulf of Mexico? Could it be a fish that was spawned in the Caribbean? Basically trying to better understand how the entire population of yellowfin in the Atlantic is connected. And we're doing that through electronic tagging. So we use those pop-up archival satellite tags. And we also got involved in a big conventional tagging project that was run through ICAT. And they tagged like 120,000 tropical tunas. So yellowfins, big eyes, and skipjack primarily throughout the entire North Atlantic. And myself and the colleagues I mentioned previously, we kind of focused on the Northwest region. figure out what's happening from basically Canada to the Gulf of Mexico and see how our fish, quote unquote, are connected to the rest of the Atlantic.
What do we know so far?
That's a great question. So we've learned some. Yellowfin are a very tough species to keep pop-up satellite tags on. They're very active. So we've struggled a little bit with having the tags stay on for as long as we wanted them. So we asked the tag to stay on for 9 to 12 months because we kind of want to get that full year migration. And we've only had a few that have actually done that because the yellowfins don't like being tagged. They are so active, they break the tags off. Or as we talked about before, unfortunately, we do have a problem with predation of the tagged animals. But we've learned some cool stuff. We still have a long way to go, but some of the fish we've tagged in the local canyons over the last few years haven't made any big migrations. We've have a couple fish that have given us data through the winter, and they're, in the grand scheme of things in the North Atlantic, staying fairly close to home. We've had a couple go down towards Bermuda. Some other ones that are out kind of milling around in the seamounts area at the northern edge of the Gulf Stream in the winter. We haven't seen what we maybe thought or expected to see, and that would be a beeline for one of those spawning areas. One cool thing that kind of just came through recently is part of that ICAT conventional tagging project. We finally started to get some recaptures from Africa, but it took years for that to happen. So I tagged a whole bunch of fish in like hydro and veach in 2020, maybe 2019. I can't even remember when it was, but just this past spring, we started to get recaptures of those fish, and we hadn't gotten any recaptures from Africa previously. So then, we take that little tiny bit of information and we start thinking about, okay, does that mean that they're not making annual migrations back to this area? So we know that the yellowfin up here are connected to Africa in some way, but how regularly do those movements occur? And that's kind of where we want to go to next, looking at that long multi-year picture to see, what, instead of what does a year in the life of a yellowfin look, maybe like what does 3 years in the life of a yellowfin look like?
That's so cool, because we always think about fish as migrating, kind of like birds, that they, maybe head in one direction in the winter and then back in the summer, make these 1 year migrations. To think that maybe it's every few years that some of these fish travel completely across the ocean is fascinating. Are there any DNA studies of yellowfin populations that have shown kind of differences in the populations where they're spawned, that there's maybe different stocks, or has that?
Yeah, you can definitely see there's some different techniques. I'm not super up to speed on the literature about genetics, but I know that people have looked into otolith microchemistry. Mm-hmm. So otoliths are the ear bones that form in fish, and just they start off really small when a fish is spawned as a larvae, and then over time they kind of grow and add rings, kind of like trees. So otoliths are often a structure that are used to estimate age in fish. But the chemistry of the water is what is kind of like marked in the otolith. So you are a product of your surroundings. So you can tell where a fish was spawned based on the chemistry of the otolith that formed when it was a larvae or in its first year of life. So I think there have been some studies in yellowfin. I should have brushed up better, but I'm pretty sure that you can see the different spawning components. Mm-hmm. But I don't think we've yet. What we want to do is try to put it all together and look at the big picture. We know that there's different areas that they're spawning in, but we want to know if it's you spawn just here or if you move throughout your life, and how is that related to migration and movement. So the story is still coming together for the species. There's little bits and pieces of it, but we're trying to go in a direction where we put everything together.
And from an angling point of view, it kind of gives you a better appreciation when you're out there in the canyons fishing for yellowfin. And we tend to think so locally and think, well, there was a good season last year. Maybe there'll be a good season this year, when really those fish could have moved to Africa. They could have, you realize it's connected to such a bigger role in the ocean. And maybe it gives you just a better excuse if you don't catch.
Yeah, they're all in Africa. But I never really thought about where I do a lot of thinking about the bluefin spawning sites. You have the Mediterranean, the Gulf of Mexico. They just discovered one in the Slope Sea. And I guess I never really considered where our yellowfin were coming from. You think of those canyon, those you call them tropical tunas, and they just seem like they live their life based on the Gulf Stream. It never occurred to me that they were going that that far. I didn't know our yellowfin were going to the Gulf of Mexico and then also showing up in our canyons, let alone going to Africa.
Yeah, that's one of the interesting things, though. So we're collaborating with scientists from the Southeast Fisheries Science Center in Miami who are doing basically the same type of work. And they've done a lot of work in the Gulf of Mexico. We just had a meeting about this last week, and they don't see much movement of yellowfin out of the Gulf. One of the big things is that the Gulf fish seem to be fairly resident to the Gulf. And they kind of captured that well along with other researchers. And we're trying to look at, what's happening outside the Gulf in the Caribbean and specifically the Carolinas and up in our neck of the woods to see, are they really, if they're connected, and how so, or are they really separate? And then if the answer is yes, then you go back to the idea that you said before about, is it different stocks of fish? Right now it's currently the Atlantic yellowfin. So it's a one big giant stock throughout the whole Atlantic, but do we need to break that down a bit more? That's basically the question we're trying to get at.
Now, one thing I heard that you can probably tell me that it's not true at all, and I can't remember who I was talking with this about, but it was somebody, it wasn't on a podcast, but it was with another tuna fisherman up here in New England, and he said, our yellowfin up here do more moving than, and you supported that by saying the Gulf of Mexico ones are almost more residential. He said, that's why you're more likely to see the Allison tuna down there. He said that our yellowfin moves so much that they burn off the fins. The Allison fins is some yellowfin, when they get to a certain size, their two back fins become dramatically long, almost as long as the tail. And for a while they thought they were a different species, so they called them Allison tuna. Now it's just kind of a cool catch. It's a yellowfin, but they're not actually burning them off by swimming so much. Or is that something that, are they really that fragile?
I don't know. It sounds interesting.
Yeah. I honestly have not heard that before, but we've seen Allisons up here in the canyons, right? And they're coming from somewhere. So they've done a lot of swimming to get here. It's a question that I get a lot, and I have the same questions as you have. Like, why do we have the different morphologies of the fish? The one thing that I will say is those big Allisons are more related to, like, when I think of them, I think of like warm water or tropical tunas, like really blue, warm water. And I believe that in the canyons up here, when people do get them, they're fishing out in the deep in like the really, really warm stuff. Down in the Caribbean, you get those big sickle fins too. And then in the Gulf, a 90 pounder could have big sickles. And up here, we got a 90 pounder whose sickle fins look more like a bluefin. I don't think anyone has ever figured out why that occurs. And so I can't really say more, but other than that, I too am curious.
Now, we've had a tremendous run of yellowfin inshore, what we consider inshore, which is, inside of the canyons the last couple of years. In 2021, it seemed to be off the South Shore of Long Island. They had them at the Coimbra. And this year, it seemed to be just off Block Island. And that's, been a tremendous fishery in addition to the great inshore bluefin fishing. But that seems to be very tied into the squid. Squid numbers seem to have brought those yellowfin in close for us.
Yeah, it's like I said before with the threshers, if there's food to be had, the predators will find it. Right? So in the 90s, we had great, and probably 80s, with great yellowfin inshore fishing, right? I've seen photos of people getting 150, 200 pound yellows from Tuna Ridge area dump. And I grew up fishing in Montauk, and the guys that I fished with were saying how they used to be able to go out to the Butterfish Hole and chunk up, yellowfins and bluefins. So them being inshore is it's not abnormal, but yeah, it's just like the ocean is not a static environment. It changes year to year. If there's food around and fish find it, they're going to aggregate there and exploit it. So we've just been lucky that there's something that's around that's bringing the yellows in. So I personally hope that it continues to happen. It's great. It's nice to not have to go so far. And hopefully it's a sign that the population is doing well. There was the yellowfin stock assessment that's done by ICAT. There was a couple years ago, it was not looking so good. There was concern that the population was kind of going in the wrong direction, but the most recent stock assessment kind of changed its tune and said that the population is actually doing better. So let's hope that that is true and that it's manifested by good inshore fishing for the next couple years.
Sounds good to me. Yeah. Did you have any other questions on tuna, or do you want to move to?
No. I mean, we can move into just we could talk about the Albie project that you're working on.
Sure.
Is that good?
Yeah. Kind of a smaller but tuna-like fish that you also work with is false albacore, and that's new as of this year, right? That project.
Yeah, that's definitely something new. It's the work is organized through the American Saltwater Guides Association. So a friend and colleague, Dr. Willie Goldsmith, and I kind of put this project together. Willie was kind of the brainchild of it, getting some funding together to do the project and getting building the infrastructure to do the work with some of the local guides in New England. But we kind of came at it with the scientific questions of, this is a huge fishery in New England. People spend a lot of money on it. They look forward to it every year, but we don't really know much about the species. The albies kind of show up and then they disappear and they go somewhere, but we don't really know where. And it's kind of the same story that I've been telling with our tagging. Like, we're trying to tell a story about the fish. Like, we know we have a tidbit of it in New England when we see them in the sounds, but when they leave, where are they going? There's a different mentality about false albacore when you get kind of south of North Carolina. I know there's a big wreck fishery for them down there, but off Florida, they're more of like a bait fish, like bonita. It's not really revered in the way that it is up here. So as an unmanaged species that really doesn't have a lot of scientific information about it, that was where we came from, is just try to do a pilot project to start to learn about the albies in our area and see how they're connected to other places along the east coast of the U.S.
Now, you were using acoustic tags for a lot of that. I remember because when we were communicating ahead of this, you said, I guess it was last Monday, you pulled the acoustic receivers out they were using with the Albie project.
Yep.
So do you already have have you been getting some good data back from that?
Yeah, so we used acoustic telemetry is right. It's a technique that I use a lot for this works or shark work. It's how we track the sand tigers and the sandbars. And I also have a big offshore wind project going on in southern New England. We're all using the same type of tags, acoustic telemetry. It's the same type of tags that are used to track the white sharks off the Cape. It's the same type of tags that Mass DMF uses for their striped bass research. So it's really good in that we have a massive array of acoustic receivers or listening stations that can pick up our tagged fish throughout Massachusetts. And we share data across projects, across researchers to kind of amplify what we can learn. For the Albie project, I'm not ready to let the cat out of the bag for that, but I'm happy that tagging was a really big success. We met our tagging milestones. I think we deployed 63 tags, which was great. And we will be ready to release some information about the results probably in the next month. And then the next phase of the study is looking at the bigger picture. So acoustic telemetry is all about data sharing. So these acoustic receivers that we use here, other researchers have them all up and down the coast, all the way down to Florida and Gulf of Mexico. And we're hoping that our tagged albies swim down that way and get picked up by those receivers. And then through some data sharing networks, we hopefully can get that information back and then start to put together that whole picture of the migration of albies up and down the coast. And the tags have a 1-year battery life. So they just started their job a month or two ago, and they got 9-10 months left of battery power. And we're hoping that we can use that and track them all the way back to New England next summer. So really the story won't be complete until around this time next year when we see if the albies that we tagged this year came back to the region. So it'll be like little tidbits that we release over time, again, trying to put together a big story.
Cool. So how close do they have to swim to these receivers? Is it 100 yards? Is it a half mile? How?
That's a great question. So it's a complex answer, and I'll say it depends. So whenever you have sound in the water, so the acoustic transmitters emit a sound pulse, an ultrasonic ping, and sound is distorted in water by a lot of different things. What's in the water, current, temperature, presence of thermocline, things like that. So it really depends. We've seen the range be as low as maybe a couple 100 feet. So you got to be really close to the receiver. And then in some really low current, deep waters, you can be up to 3,000 feet away.
Wow.
So it's one of the things that we try to quantify in our study, because we need to be able to know, okay, how far away from the receiver can we hear a fish? And it's a hard thing to track, but we need to kind of learn about it as much as we can so we can interpret our data correctly.
Now, you mentioned wind farms are another project that you've been working on and doing some study of fish and how they relate to wind farms. Can you tell me a little bit? Because that's something that I know that our audience has a lot of interest in. We're seeing wind farms getting developed up and down the coast, and everyone's asking the same question: what is this going to mean for fishing? At least that's what fishermen are asking.
That's my question too. Again, it's that blending of passion and profession. I kind of am double dipping again with my work in offshore wind. I got into it because I saw that it was coming, and it was coming rapidly, and we didn't really know about how the development activities are going to affect the species that are found in the area, and then by extension, the fisheries that target them. So I kind of focused on my typical highly migratory pelagic fish angle with sharks and tunas, and designed a tagging study to try to monitor what is going to happen to those fish once offshore wind starts ramping up. So I did it kind of piecemeal. It took several years to put it together. But this past year, it's the first year where I've done it. I'm doing it the way where I think it should be done, where we're monitoring for the presence of tagged animals throughout all of the lease areas in southern New England, which is a massive area, essentially from Cox Ledge all the way down to Banana on the southwest part of the shoals. So we have those acoustic receivers throughout that whole area, and we're tagging a bunch of different species: bluefin, yellowfin, makos, blue sharks, threshers, sandbars, duskies, basically everything that we know that occurs in this region. And right now we're just kind of trying to document the status quo. So we know that those fish exist in this region. It's been known for many, many years. That's really not news or nothing new to anyone. But we're trying to correlate it with things. So what temperatures are they? What are the water temperatures on the surface and bottom when they're in these regions? What time of year are they here? Are they using every little nook and cranny of the southern New England region? We know that they come here, but when they are here, how much space do they use? So we're just trying to gather what we call baseline data or pre-construction information about, what's normal for this region for all these different species. And then hopefully by continuing this project over time, as the wind farms start to be built and eventually be run, we'll just basically do the same thing over and over and over again, year after year. And over time, we'll be able to identify what, if any, effects the whole operation has on the fish that have been using these areas for a long, long time.
Yeah, there's really no other way to answer the questions of what effect will construction have? Will that keep fish out of the area? And then once that they're actually in place, will they become fish aggregates and actually bring fish into the area?
But one thing we not to cut you off, but we ran an article about the Block Island wind farms where the question was, is this increasing habitat and drawing more fish into the area, or is it just concentrating the fish that were already there?
Yeah, there's a ton of different questions, and it's going to affect each species differently, right? So the benefits in the Block Island wind farm are obvious. There's a lot of more sea bass there. You can go fluking right around, and the fluke like to hang out around structure. And it's a great question of whether it's aggregation or it's in new habitat and they're flourishing. There's actually more fish, so there's a lot of work that's going to go into trying to tease those questions apart, because they're not easy questions to answer, even scientifically. You need to do multiple studies over a long period of time to really get at them. The Block Island wind farm is kind of pointed to because it's what we know. There are turbines there, but at least for me, it's a little bit different with these highly migratory fishes because they're moving around so much more. They use presumably a much bigger area. They're not kind of as resident as you think as black sea bass, where it's going to a reef and that's its optimal spot. A bluefin, who knows where it could be in a day. It could swim 50, 60 miles, right, and cover a big area. And we're talking about an area where there could be 800 to 1,000 turbines, and there's Block Island has 5, and the size and geographic extent and footprint of what's proposed is just so much greater. The big question that is prevalent in the scientific community is kind of like, what's the aggregative effect? Like, what's going to happen when everything's put together? We have little bit of information from a couple turbines, but when you start having 100, 200, 300, 400 all in this area, how will it affect the entire area? You're taking wind energy is all about taking power out of the environment. You take power from the wind and you turn it into electricity, right? But that wind energy is used to being transferred to the water, right? Because you have waves, and then all that energy gets translated into the ocean, and that drives currents, circulation, stratification of the water column, like where the thermocline is. There's so many different layers of questions, like oceanographic questions. I'm a biologist, so I think about the animals, but other people are trying to figure out what's happening to the water, what's happening to the bottom. So there's just so many
even
questions.
Human behavior too. Like, you see the Block Island wind farm has affected where people fish and when. It's concentrating fishermen in that area. It's yet another thing to look at.
Yeah, it's kind of the new frontier of research, not only in New England, but everywhere. I mean, if you look along the coast, there's wind farms being proposed everywhere. North Carolina up to Gulf of Maine, they're coming, and we got a lot of work to do to try to get set up to monitor what's going to happen. And that's what I'm trying to do in New England, is get ahead of things as best I can and lay the groundwork to try to assess what's happening to the fish. And then by extension, we'll figure out what's happening to the fisheries. It could be like the oil rigs in Louisiana, where those yellowfins are just there all the time and we're getting wahoos and there's more mahis. It could be a positive thing, or it could be, wow, it's really hard to fish around in a wind farm where you have turbines spaced every mile, and if you got a fleet of boats jigging or trolling, there's a whole lot of questions, and I think that I'll be trying to answer them for the rest of my career.
Yeah, I would say 2 things that really jump out at me from this whole conversation. One is that here we are in 2022, and it kind of strikes me how much we still don't know about so many fish species and about the ocean in general. And then the other one is how much the tagging technology that you really have specialized in your career is fairly new. I mean, that's really over the last decade or 2 decades, it's become more common, more affordable. How much we've been able to learn in just the past couple decades from that tagging technology. And so as a researcher, kind of in the prime of your career right now, as a fisherman, what are the biggest questions you have with this technology, with your interest in recreational fishing? Kind of what are your biggest research goals over the rest of your career? What are the questions you want to answer?
Where do we begin? Well, I'll say, like I said throughout the podcast, my passion drives my profession, right? I grew up a fisherman. I love going fishing and I love experiencing good fishing. So I want to continue to do research that's going to help us solve problems. Every fishery has problems. You have ups and downs, but you need to be able to make responsible decisions and justify those decisions. Sometimes you got to make hard ones, like with the Makos now, but we're hoping that things like that will make it better for the future and for the species. So as a whole, my goal is, sustainability in fisheries and responsible fishing. That's why I like do things like this. And I try to welcome conversation with fishermen, because there's different ways to solve problems. It's good to hear about different problems that people are experiencing. And I want to keep the lines of communication open. I learn a lot about fishermen. I rely on them for my research to help me. The guys that are on the water every day, telling me what they see, and that's valuable information. And I think it's an area that I'd like to push more, basically better integration between the scientific community and the fishing industry. I hope to be able to do that as kind of a steward of both sides. Sometimes it's not easy, but I'm always interested in pursuing it more. And then just on a personal note, my favorite fish is hands down the tautog. And I have yet to do any dedicated research on them. Hoping to do it, start up real soon. So as kind of like a selfish thing, I would love to start learning more about them.
And what is it about them that makes them your favorite fish?
Oh, well, I think it's a lot of things. I grew up fishing for them when I was a kid. So I have those nostalgic memories of having my uncle teach me how to tog fish in his boat. And I think I like them for a challenge. You can't just go over and find a spot and automatically start catching togs and good ones. There's a science to it, I guess. Finding out where they are, figuring out how the tide affects them, But I'm fascinated by them as well. Like, you go back to a rock year after year and they're there, and they leave and they come back and find it. Is that the same group of fish year after year that are coming back to the rock, like the sand tigers in Wollaston and Duxbury? Am I fishing on the same togs year after year in Buzzards Bay? Like, questions like that. Just, I'm so curious about it. And I just want to know. And then I rely on them a lot for food. I love eating them, and that's what sustains me through the winter. So I want to do what I can to make sure that I can continue to eat them and enjoy fishing for them for as long as I live in this region.
One thing you might find interesting about tog, one of my favorite time wasters at work has been the live camera that the Massachusetts Maritime Academy has off the west end of the canal. And there was one clip, I didn't see it, somebody saved it and posted it, of a gray seal coming through the camera and about a dozen good-sized tog right on its tail, like clearly following it. It came through twice, and the tog were behind it both times. That was something I would think it would be the opposite. I would think that the seal would be chasing the tog away, but I don't know if the seal's feeding would root up crabs or something. Anyhow, just as you go to study tog, there you go. You're off to a good start now.
My guess there is the safest place to be with respect to a predator is behind it, away from the business end. They know that problem is arising is at the front of that seal. So I would want to be as far away from that business end as possible. So I would keep right on that seal's tail and follow it around until it got bored so it could never come around and take care of business.
That's a good point. I was surprised how fast they were. I couldn't believe that they were keeping pace with it. But anyhow, Jeff, thank you so much for coming on and giving us the time, man. I learned a lot. I think our listeners are going to learn a lot. And I can't wait to hear more and see more about the Yellowfin Tuna. So how can people find, if they want to continue to follow up on your research, how can they find you or your work?
Yeah, so that's when I'm not a big social media guy. I don't post on anything. I'm kind of more traditional in that sense. But I do write blog posts now and again on the Anderson Cabot Center for Ocean Life website. I kind of do them periodically just to talk about our different projects. So there's blogs about sandbars, there's blogs about sand tigers, yellowfin, threshers, skates, offshore wind. So that's kind of like the one-stop shop to find out about what I've been up to.
It's great.
And one last plug again for the New England Aquarium, which personally played a role. I visited the aquarium when I was a kid, and that's what led me down a career of being interested in fish and fisheries. And it's an awesome place. Definitely go visit if you haven't in a while. Bring your family and your kids there. And also recognizing that the New England Aquarium supports things like conservation, research. They do so much education, like the Anderson Cabot Center for Ocean Life. So
yeah, thanks. It's a great place. Yeah, I still go and visit and definitely endorse second that endorsement, and just happy to be able to work in a place that allows me to pursue my passion, I guess, and try to do some work that's going to help have more responsible and sustainable fishing in New England.